Hey there, and thanks for listening to the Beyond These Clinic Walls podcast. I'm your host, Julia, a PT turned product professional, joined by my delightful partner in crime co-hosts, Emma.
This is my tribe. This is how I think.
And Emily.
That is the best getting into PT story I've ever heard.
Founders of the Clinician Transition. Each episode, we interview former rehab professionals who have leveraged their clinical skills into non-traditional roles. I invite you to come hear the journeys, follow the career paths, and learn about the opportunities beyond these clinic walls. On today's episode of Beyond These Clinic Walls, we talk all things innovative with the inventor of Nuvio himself, Matt Cumella. Matt is a physical therapist who has spent his career working with complex injury and geriatric populations. He founded Nuvio in 2020 as a company committed to demonstrating the impact advanced assistive devices can have on functional outcomes. When he's not talking about reimagining functional mobility, you can find him golfing, enjoying a local brew beer, listening to the Beyond These Clinic Walls podcast, or watching the Celtics. Happy listening!
My company is called Nuvio, N-U-V-I-O. We are taking an outcomes-based, very clinician-led approach to developing novel assistive devices, the modern walker, you could say.
Every headline you've seen about healthcare, doctors and nurses, doctors and nurses. Well, guess what? There's more than just doctors and nurses in healthcare.
So, I don't know, assistive devices, it just started getting in my head. At some point, I kind of just said to myself, like, it was still a lot more failure, but I was just like, I'm really like curious, like, what is like success? Like, how do you develop a product like this? And 6 weeks later, I had a provisional patent.
So then if there's this increased need and then a wide demand of requirements, how did you hone in on all of that to create the product that you did? What led you in that direction specifically? Hey, how's it going? So excited. Great to have you here.
Yeah, great to be here.
I love it. So Matt, my first question usually for guests is just to have you give a general overview, high level of kind of your career journey, just like the big picture items.
Sure. So I've been practicing around Boston my whole career. I graduated from the University of Central Florida, their DPT program in 2014. Came straight up here because I'm from New England in general, Connecticut area, and then have a bunch of, right? I have a bunch of friends in Boston area and obviously a great kind of healthcare town. And really my career has been inpatient rehab focused, post-acute rehab focused, pretty through and through, mostly full-time treating therapist. Dipped my toe into sort of assistant RD and then RD roles that quickly pulled right back out of, just was not for me. And that was kind of when I started to make the non-clinical shift, or at least started thinking non-clinically.
Were you always looking to go inpatient even when you were at school, or did that kind of happen once you got into your clinicals, or just like after you got some more real world experience?
Yeah, it was my third clinical, a burn trauma ICU rotation. Prior to that, it was all outpatient and all like sports outpatient. Yeah. I was definitely like, that classic, I'm going to be like, the Celtics, right, lead PT or something. Yeah. And then the Wednesday before the Monday when my rotation started, for that one, I was supposed to do an acute, but like a light acute, like a very straightforward acute. And my would-be CI, I think she like quit her job. Just got pulled into like an office.
Non-clinical. No.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And they were just like, we don't know where you're going to go. They moved a bunch of stuff around. Yeah. And a level 1 trauma center in town that we sent a ton of students to. They had a CI who was like, I'll take him. And yeah, it was terrifying, but it was the best experience ever. And yeah, that was definitely when I made that shift.
Yeah. And that's kind of what hooked you. That's what drew you in.
Yeah. Saw a lot of things very early, very immediate dependent transfers. My CI was like this little tiny, like 5'2", 100 pounds. And on day one, C5 complete. Wow. I'm not even kidding. 350 pounds probably. And just did a single dependent slide board transfer with him. From then it was tons of that. And it was jumping in headfirst kind of thing to that. It kind of gave me that impatient side, that impatient itch.
I feel like that's always the case. You always have the small people doing the biggest transfers. I feel like that's always been my experience too. And then they just completely knock it out of the park. And you're like, wow, okay. I have to use my body better if they just crush that. That's too cool.
Yeah.
And then you eventually went to go get your GCS too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what was the motive there after had you worked in the clinic for some time and then you're thinking like, let's continue clinically, or do you just like old people?
Yeah, a little bit of both, I guess. It was definitely like a lifelong learning thing. So I got it in 2018. So been practicing for 3 or 4 years. Had a lot of friends who were going for their specialties. It's one of those things where like none of us really know what they do other than like giving you a skill set, right? There's no like you're on a track with it.
Mm-hmm.
I actually went GCS over like trying for the NCS because when you look at them, when you look at what skill sets they really cover, it's geriatric, but it also is like this very nice, geriatric is just really a kind of way of saying people who are more vulnerable to a lot of different things.
True.
And so it felt like it had a good deal of neuro, a good deal of cardiac, and just sort of like another layer beyond, what we got in school.
Yeah.
And was just super like applicable to my caseload.
Yeah.
And so, it was really hard. I honestly thought I failed it after the test.
Really?
It was
harder than the boards?
Yeah.
I haven't taken any specialty certifications, but would you say it's harder than the boards?
I thought it was a lot harder. From what I remember, I think you just really get a pass fail. So I have no idea how I did on sort of a spectrum.
Yeah.
But I walked out and was not feeling good.
That's the worst feeling. But you passed, which is great.
I passed.
What do you feel like you took from that experience of having to take that test? Did you feel like you were able to apply the things you learned into practice? Sometimes I feel like with the test taking, you learn to take a test and it's not always applicable. Do you feel that way, or do you feel that you were able to apply it?
Yeah, I did. More so from how I studied and what I learned studying than what was the material on the test itself.
Yeah.
The material on the test itself, at least the test I took, it was a good chunk of sort of like their history. Here's their pharma related to, and then how does that impact? And it was just that one after another.
Yeah.
But a lot of the study materials was a good deal of preventative things related to declines in function, how to screen for osteoporosis or, lots of different things related to that. So a lot of kind of tools in your tool chest related to the aging process. And I think a good deal of like old, not weak, kind of like how to really like challenge in a way that is impactful to someone's longevity. That I think in school we get a little bit of the lighter, side of that, right? Not so much ankle pumps and long arc quads, but how to maintain someone's power and the impact that can have on their long-term quality of life, stuff like that.
I'm always interested in the specialties and the testing with that. It's impressive. Something that I considered possibly going down, and then I took the non-traditional route and I was like, let's see where else we could go with these things.
What were you considering when you were looking at them?
OCS, which I feel like is like the standard, like the Gryffindor of the tests. That's it. But I was considering
it's an awesome way to put it.
Yeah, I was like in the outpatient sports, kind of that realm. So I figured that would be the most applicable. Talk to me about the end of clinical and then into your business.
Yeah, it was a very long and winding process. I think with the populations that I treat, obviously it's like 9 out of 10 assistive devices are involved. You're leaving my setting when you're kind of like moving off of those. And oftentimes you're leaving with them. And I think it was just, right, everybody has their kind of thing that frustrates them clinically. And to me, I spent a good deal of my time up in Lexington, Concord at a CCRC, tons of money, honestly, really. And so you would have these motivated patients where you didn't even need to write an LMN for something to get covered because there was a lot of it was just finances wasn't an issue,
right? Which is
just a piece to the puzzle. So it it wasn't accessibility price wise of equipment. It was more need matching what was available to kind of best fit it.
Yeah.
And it also being a CCRC, I think you see that, I saw the full continuum. I was the lead on the inpatient side there, but also did outpatient and saw plenty of outpatient, saw plenty of our inpatients become outpatient patients. And you see how there's just so much overlap in the issues. And so, I don't know, assistive devices, it just started getting in my head. Probably one of the first times I thought of how it was impacting maybe someone's care scenario was someone who was like supervision level but like needed their assistive device,
Yeah.
and they had trouble with, two-step command following. Really, they were like a mild cognitive impairment. There was someone in the AL next door,
Yeah.
and they kept coming back for falls.
Mm.
And poor hand placement and sequencing was, it was during sit-to-stand episodes where they were having those falls, and they were recurring, and I remember just watching a treatment session of other therapists with them and just knowing the patient, and them going, of course, through like hand placement and sequencing training with them, and just kind of saying like, this is this person's impairment. It's sort of like the device is not meeting their need. You're not giving them another option.
Yeah.
And that just was where it's like you start to realize that these are almost like when you give someone an assistive device, every element of their day-to-day function, it's this new movement system that you've created when you give them this device.
Yeah.
And that being frustrated with the state of things, it got in my head more often, and it went kind of from the back of my mind to the front of my mind. I started sketching ideas and writing things down, got really crazy. And, on a Saturday would go to Home Depot and get some PVC pipe or some wood and build some stuff. And it would be terrible. It would be ridiculous, right? It would be like 3 hours of a Saturday morning. And then this is a bad idea. Like what are you doing?
Yeah.
And that lasted for it was maybe like 2 of those Saturdays over like a year leading up to the pandemic. And then my wife and I moved on March 14th, 2020, like the Saturday before we all were home permanently, to Brooklyn, which was also the epicenter.
Yep.
And I had just per diem set up. That was when I was like, maybe I'll make this non-clinical shift. She got this great job. I had my job here. It was a job she was going to take for 1.5 to 2 years. And my job here in Boston said, we'll take you when you come back. So it was this very easy sort of like, let's go. And maybe I'll like try a non-clinical or just try something new.
Sure.
And so I did the thing where I think a lot of people do it, where like you just have per diem in the interim until you kind of get the lay of the land. Yeah. And then there was nothing, right? I'm like the lowest. I had no job essentially.
What kind of roles were you looking for at that time? Sorry to interject.
On the non-clinical side, what I was interested in was like health informatics, like kind of data analysis.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was something I was not like I just liked it.
Yeah.
I didn't have a certification or anything, right? It was very early, but it was like, this is cool. Maybe I can kind of, in this spare time, work on, towards that type of a role, probably something similar to what you're in now. Mm-hmm. But that was kind of where my head was at for the non-clinical stuff. And then we lasted like 2 weeks in Brooklyn, and we got up to New Hampshire. We have a family's lake house in New Hampshire, and only so much continuing ed, honestly. Like, we were there for 3 months, and after a month, these like notebooks that I had laying around from a year ago, one popped up. And I honestly just started getting back in the garage with all that spare time.
Yeah.
And at some point I kind of just said to myself, like, it was still a lot more failure, but I was just like, I'm really like curious, like, what is like success? Like, how do you develop a product like this?
Yeah.
I have engineering friends. I have like family with engineering background. And so those conversations just not turned more serious, but just became interesting.
Yeah.
Started reaching out to and like being connected with people who develop products, industrial designers, mechanical engineers, which is typically like a pairing to do like a hardware product.
Yeah.
And they would just tell me like, look, if you want to do this, you don't need to like hire someone like us. This is your idea. This is like what you're doing in the garage and just building mock-ups. It's like what you do, but categorize it, document it, like build a process for it. So your failures kind of like don't just keep creeping up on you. And you actually, if you're going to get somewhere, you get somewhere.
Right.
And 6 weeks later, I had a provisional patent.
Wow.
And that was kind of, that was very much the early going. And that was one step of many where like every step was like, I'm only going to do this next step, see if it's going to be a dead end. Yeah. Right.
You said something really interesting in there. You said, what does success look like when you hit it? Was there any point when you were working that you have an idea that's just crazy enough that you're like, this might work, and now I know how it works, or now I know how to measure success? Like, what does that success look like to you?
Like kind of iterating on the product ideas that I had?
Yeah. Or like even I think I'd love to know, at what point did it come from like your mind to being like, all right, let's run with this as a prototype. And then at its final stage of prototype to be like, all right, it's patent ready.
That's a great question. I think Fortunately, these devices are simple enough that someone like me can mock up something that then you can use at a low level in a garage, right? It was still a hope and a prayer. Like there was so much beyond that that I didn't even know was going to come beyond that. I think I've definitely learned, like I would say looking back now, what I did in the garage was good enough for what they would call a proof of concept, and think that you could make a successful, like very usable prototype off of it. I had no idea then anything in terms of like, there's a big difference between a prototype and something you can manufacture and commercialize. And that I've learned a lot of since then. So I didn't even realize I was taking that leap.
Yeah.
So I guess kind of like to answer that question, like I only knew up until like a very still like small portion of the process that I was confident enough with what I'd been told from these industrial designers who I spoke with, but kind of didn't know what I was getting into still beyond that, you know?
Yeah. So what were you getting into? What was the rest of the scope?
Well, it's a very intensive process, I think, to make something that is you can build a business around. I mean, you can sell successfully, right? The early going that kept me going was success in those prototypes, and then recognizing bill of materials costs and how to source materials and where is this going to be built. And then all of that has to like funnel through to a line in a way that you still feel like you can keep going. FDA regulations, fortunately, that's like pretty light for us, but just learning that could have easily been a dead. I think more than most people would do early on, because I recognized enough that if the answer was this needs clinical trials, I'm out, like I'm done, you know?
Like that's where I draw the line.
Yeah. And I was like, I need to know that now.
Yeah.
Which is like, you can't learn on your own, or at least if you're going to really know it for sure, you have to kind of work with a consultant on it.
Yeah.
But I did that very early for that reason.
Yeah.
So things like that, those all just sort of like at a certain point, I would literally have different conversations or early on I got into an incubator, which I didn't know what those were until this process, but it had a lot of mentors and a lot of different people that, you can go to in really every aspect of kind of building a startup. And I would have a conversation, and then that would be like almost my homework for the week was like, okay, I'm going to learn more about this side of things. And that was a lot of the very like the first 6 months or so.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you know what the threshold would have made it need to have a clinical trial?
So a lot of it is based off of predicate and if there's predicate in the marketplace. And so since this device is going to be classified as a transfer aid, which there's plenty of predicate for, and a walker, which there's plenty of predicate for. And beyond the predicate, it's like levels of invasiveness to like the human body and the risk associated with that. So this is very non-invasive. And so it makes it exempt from those things that require clinical trials. And then the fact that it had predicate, if I was trying to say this is like totally new, but it's like non-invasive, then you have to go down like a path that you just have to establish what it is. And so that almost is its own clinical trial. Like you can't point to, it's like these things that none of these needed they call it like a 510K and a GMP, which are like a GMP is like the development process is intensified, like the stuff that you have to do, the risk management. And then the 510K is like the clinical trial aspect of it. And so we're at the classification that walkers and transfer aids are at. They're exempt from that. And really you just have to register with the FDA and say, we are this. And then you have to follow their guidelines in development and manufacturing from like a risk management perspective and almost like a quality assurance perspective, which is fairly low level. It's almost like stuff you would want to do anyways to a certain extent.
Like
not build them in your garage. Yeah. Like liabilities and like building to standards for those reasons. Yeah.
I feel like there's so many potential regulations, especially. So are you classified as like a walker, or are you like, can you tell us about like how you define your product and then how you define it in the eyes of the FDA?
So very similarly, I mean, we try to talk about it like a functional mobility device, right? Okay. The idea that functional mobility is more than kind of like an individual category of walking or of transfers, but typically assistive devices are designed as a walking aid, right? Within a single category. And so that's unique, but you can get multiple classifications from the FDA. So we will have a registration as a transfer aid and a registration as a walking aid, because they don't have a functional overall aid classification. Yeah.
And will that help? Because Medicare will cover one walker. Would that help to potentially have an insurance company cover your device?
Yeah, the reimbursement process is as much of a pain in the ass as you might guess. So a lot of other assistive devices, rollators, different types of those are not bothering with reimbursement because it's slimming down. I mean, front wheel walkers are like the only thing left standing. It used to be commodes and other things, right? So it's really trimming. But for us, we might try to go that path. If we have a really successful pilot that really demonstrates like kind of like outcomes-based benefits, we'll probably go the path of you can try to get a unique code where, since we think we're a transfer aid and a walking aid, you can get a unique HCPCS code, which is that Medicare code that lets a walker be covered. And it would basically give us, much more than the average walking aid. Like walkers are covered fully because they, like front-wheeled walkers are covered fully because they are. If you want to get a rollator and have a physician write a script, they place a price based on the code on that rollator, and they give you like $82 regardless of the price of the rollator actually, or they give you 80% of like $82 because that's Medicare, especially if it's Part B. For us, we would get, like we've estimated, we would get like triple that. So we might get like, $250, $300 off, something like that. So it might be worthwhile, but there's likely no path where like it's covered fully, except for FSA and HSA, which every walker is covered fully if you have that in your FSA, HSA account. And then different insurances typically follow suit of Medicare. So you wouldn't expect that from them. So it's kind of become the way of it with assistive devices that they're just getting covered less and less in the US. In other countries, they're very heavily covered. It's very clinician led. Like if a PTOT writes a script, insurance, especially in universal healthcare countries, they're covering for that device up to, even like the $1,500 specialty devices in a lot of countries.
Do you think there's like a lack of innovation in this medical device arena of transfer aids and walker aids? I feel like the obvious answer is yes, because otherwise you wouldn't have created something. But do you think that is there? You mentioned too how they're getting covered less and less. So I think that might have been a catalyst for lack of innovation, because if there's not a market for it, there's not going to be a drive to innovate.
It's really interesting because the need is skyrocketing out there, right? Aging demographic. I mean, it's actually a marketplace that is significantly growing for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
I kind of look at it as like, assisted need, there's such a spectrum, right? It's like simple product, but it's not a simple need. It's a very like complex range of needs.
Yeah.
And I think what walkers and crutches and canes and like the typical represent is like, it's really hard to solve for that across a range of environments and, what patients' impairments and past medical histories kind of like land on for what their needs are and all of that. And so when you don't really understand something fully, you overgeneralize, you stigmatize, you stereotype, and you kind of oversimplify the solution, which I think that's what like our spectrum of most accessible assistive devices look like.
Yeah.
I've felt that way even more so as I've learned about specialty assistive tech. I mean, there is so much tech in our clinic where you can control that environment, right? Partial body weight support systems that support the same populations who need walkers outside of the clinic. Because you can, when you're tethered to the clinic, you're in charge of that. So you can really solve, and you can like high fidelity solve for that. I think specialty diagnoses, robotic exoskeletons, that's a mobility device. It's just a mobility device for specific sets of needs. And when you have specific sets of needs, you can really dial in to what that should do to solve that need. So it's like a yes and no, right?
Yeah.
There's really cool things, but so many scenarios. Robotic exoskeletons as an example. I mean, someone's not, let's say it's a high level of incomplete spinal cord injury, right? Because I think MS, and there's a few diagnoses that those are covered for. When you're early on in that, really, it's not until your baseline where you can consider that if you're going to purchase it. And then they're very, very expensive. There's a lot of clinical training that goes behind them.
Yep.
So let's say that's your path where that's going to be a mode for you. And that's amazing. That's exciting. But up until you're appropriate for that, which let's say it's 6 to 12 months, you're using, you're kind of like stuck with what's not the robotic exoskeleton, right? You're stuck with the walkers, the whatever you can. And those are being used more in clinical settings where rehab hospitals are buying them up and they're using them as treatment sessions. And that's amazing again, but you have one of them. They have to be used in the treatment session. They have to be, all the clinicians are trained on it. when that one's occupied by one patient, maybe there's another patient who's appropriate for it.
Yeah.
And so all of the scenarios outside of that, again, it's a fallback to the more basically accessible equipment. And so that's kind of what I feel like I've seen is just a lack of innovation in the broad strokes spectrums of need, if that makes sense.
No, that totally does. So then if there's this increased need and then a wide demand of requirements, how did you hone in on all of that to create the product that you did? What led you in that direction specifically?
Such a great question, because I didn't. Early on, this was me in my garage, obviously. And then I started the same industrial designers and engineers who gave me that advice early. I kind of started working with them and then moved to a large product development firm as this really grew. And so now we have kind of like a team of engineers and designers finishing off the product and taking it to market.
Yeah.
And as that shifted from me, like being all things in my garage, to others, I felt like I was like the patient advocate. And it's amazing. You realize how many things we see as clinicians, and an engineer would change the way the crossbar looked, or it would kind of change the angle of the handrail.
Right.
And I would feel like I was thinking of someone, like a patient population that you've now just sort of like not solved as well for.
Yeah.
And so I would definitely like be throwing a wrench, you know what I mean, into their
Literally
process.
and metaphorically.
Yeah, for sure. But like, that's why I got into this, right? Like I didn't want to start saying, okay, we can't, do this for that. But also it's crazy and it's intuitive that you can't solve for everyone.
Sure.
It's just, that's hard when that's kind of like why you got into it. And so the way that what helped for me is focusing on outcomes. I mean, functional outcomes are it's what we measure. A patient comes in at their eval, you have your 15-point outcome measure, your FIM, 6-point scale for each item. And all of that is essentially why you're giving someone one assistive device over another, right? Why you're recommending a walker instead of a cane, because you think they're going to do better against, their functional independence status is going to be better with that device. And so that became kind of like my barometer where I would try to be a little bit like more gross against that with it. And compared to what's out there, that at least helped me kind of, I don't know, not throw a wrench into the mix so much. But I didn't have that barometer for the longest time.
It's so smart though. And that's something that I've noticed being on like the software product side, is that transfer of your clinical skills where you're not just chasing a symptom, but then you're learning how to check in on your objective and subjective measurements and go back and have those functional outcomes. Same thing, just a different product we're working on now. It's a product, not necessarily a patient. So it's like that same transferable skill. It's huge. And I think that's if you're interested in getting into product or anything, I think that's a big skill to focus on and dive a little bit deeper in, because it transfers right away.
I'm just kind of curious. So my understanding is we're past the prototype. We have the product. What's next?
What's next is hopefully running a pilot with some of those samples. So we're having a lot of conversations working on a pilot, which is, it's a clinical trial that we don't have to do, but we want to do to whatever extent we can, like 30 participants who use this for 30, 60 days against a control of traditional assistive device options, and see what the outcomes are, tested measures, things like that. And then also some samples will go to interested distributors, retailers who we've been talking with for the past few months, finally into producing like post-production models that will get shipped to people.
And are those in hospitals, or are they, you mentioned distributors, but for clinically, is it just going to be like in people's homes, or a mix of both?
A mix of both. Long term, the short term with the interested distributors is definitely on the consumer side. We definitely look at this device. We kind of think of it as helping from hospital to home. So, in the hospital, it's really front wheeled walker or bust. And we feel like we have a better option there for a lot of candidates. And then into the home on the consumer, on the more independent side, where maybe you're using a rollator or a set of canes or what have you, there's options there. But there's a lot of red tape into hospitals and selling into institutions. That's part of why we want to do that early clinical trial. We've done some market research where it's been some have been, we'd be interested in a free trial and then purchase, but definitely if you have some demonstration of data and efficacy, right, that's a big way to get your foot in the door here, which is expected. But that takes time, it takes money. So we're sort of starting on the consumer side with the idea that we grow into more the B2B institutional side.
That makes sense, because I remember when I was in the hospital, you give them the walker and they're like, well, where's the seat? I want the wheels. Like once they see it, they're going to want it.
Yeah.
I was listening to a different podcast and I thought of you, Matt, because they were talking about walkers and that the great equalizer are tennis balls, because like no matter like what age or anything you are, you have the tennis balls at the bottom of the walker. And I thought that was funny. But you are innovating way past tennis balls. You got a lot of cool things. How do you think your products are going to evolve? How do you think, do you want to branch out and do many to accommodate different populations?
We see, believe it or not, there's a lot of startups right now that are working on smart tech to incorporate into these types of devices, but really to incorporate into traditional. So gait analysis, movement analysis, different monitoring that you slap on a walker or the like. So we kind of see going that direction, but with like a better hardware platform, like a kind of a platform that helps people move better, and then incorporating those types of things. And we also, and this is going back to the garage, something that you asked me, something that you thought would work and then was patentable, and then, where did it go? There's a very early like device stabilizing concept that was part of those early patents. So it kind of keeps the device stable as someone's using it. And so we hope with a second device that we're able to R&D that, and you can think of a walker that never tips against someone with a stroke affected side. It really in real time understands that weak side and that strong side in a way that, stability promoting mobility kind of a thing.
Right.
It's really like a tech direction that we want to go with a second product. That's a long road to toe.
That's a cool vision to pursue, though. Are you just like a good builder? Like, did you have any building experience beforehand? Like, I'm creative, but I don't know if I could just go into my garage and build something. I want to kind of see some of those early drafts that you had. Were they like PVC pipe and like duct tape? Or
Oh my God. They're basic like wood and like screwing pieces of wood together. And then to some extent, like getting springs involved
cool.
and different but very basic. I mean, you look at them and like the pieces of wood are like Swiss cheese with what I was doing to them. I'm not very handy. It was, like I said, early on, it was more so like the time on my hands, and then it just kind of became something that I was almost like challenging myself to see where it could go while I still had that time on my hands.
I love it.
Yeah.
You've had the opportunity to wear a ton of different hats throughout this career journey. What role have you enjoyed the most, and which one could you do without?
That's a great question.
And it could be it doesn't have to be a role, but just like some responsibilities or aspects that you're like, this is my jam and this I could do without.
I mean, anything on the sort of day-to-day mundane business tasks like bookkeeping and things like that, outsource immediately as soon as I can, which I'm sure like no one's surprised to hear, but really anything that requires that organization side of a business and what you really have to do because you have to do it no matter what the business is. It's not the fun part.
Right.
I would say for sure is, I mentioned the patient advocacy element of product development. That has been so cool. I think personally we need more of that in assistive tech. I remember at the Rehab Tech Summit, Hobbs Rehab from the UK presented, and they're a neurorehabilitation group of clinics, and they specifically say like assistive technology companies that are trying to build devices come to us because we want to give you that clinical input and that feedback as you're developing, and they have like a structured program for it. And I think that's such a needed part of assistive tech that is often lacking when just engineers are on it. And I think clinical input, I mean, understanding functional mechanics and what an ideal movement pattern looks like in a sit-to-stand transfer or a squat, that really impacts somebody's ability to then do that when they are to whatever degree or in whatever way impaired. And, I think there's been a lot of moments where there's been times I've been throwing a wrench with the engineers, but there's also been times where they would have gone a completely different path that to me would have yielded, and I think to them, once they, we talked a little bit more about something that just like less effective. Right. And I think you need both sides of it, right? You need the clinical to go with the engineering. And I don't think we a lot of times put both into them, or at least not in the more specific space that I've entered.
That could definitely be someone's job. I remember at the hospital, someone who hadn't touched a patient in many moons, did not have any sort of therapy degree, bought thousands of new patient chairs. And then I saw them and we're like, why would you? There are so many things wrong with the chair. Why did you buy this device? And I wish there could be like a professional therapy shopper who's involved with the major decisions, because it's so important. And when you don't include us, I mean, that was a huge fail. And if they just asked us, it would have been a huge success.
I think that happens in so many ways.
For all products everywhere, I feel like.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like voice of customer, voice of expert who can speak for a bunch of customers at once, right? I think is at times the role that we play.
Yeah.
One of the buildings I worked in was a new one, and it was brand new, beautiful, decked out. So many things that functionally for like a day-to-day rehab facility made no sense, but they were pretty, right? Or they were right, or they were or they were the sort of, the most expensive version of a piece of equipment that wasn't the best for our patient population. And I think that happens a lot. And I've had plenty of sort of micro where, not to throw anyone, but like a social worker works really, really hard to buy a particular piece of equipment for someone who can't afford it, but they maybe don't talk to anyone on the clinical side, and then they wind up getting that piece of equipment and it's really not appropriate.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of like, people trying to do the best they can, but lacking the best input on something.
And maybe that's a reflection on us and not people knowing our capabilities and what we're doing as a whole. I think that where we get left behind a lot of the time. Every headline you've seen about healthcare ever since COVID happened is doctors and nurses. Well, guess what? There's more than just doctors and nurses in healthcare.
We're the middle child of the healthcare. Being that understanding the voice of the customer, understanding like the voice of the patient, you have to do your market research with it as well. Are there any challenges you have working with this population, or things that you've realized have worked really well when doing your research for what their needs are, aside from your like entire clinical background and specialty?
Yeah. I mean, definitely that we mentioned it earlier, how geriatrics is really just, you're saying, a lot of life experience. And what that means is a lot of room for a lot of different things to have happened to a lot of different people. And there's just such a spectrum, and a lot of that life experience impacting your feeling on something that you want, that even if it's maybe functionally doesn't make so much sense, it makes sense because of some experience you've had. And so that makes it difficult to do that level of research. That's part of why like it helped me to learn to pull back to outcomes-based metrics, just knowing that when you're solving for that, the person who that's the reason these devices exist in my opinion. So, the convenience factor of something else, you can definitely make that decision, but that's not going to be our sort of like aspect of the marketplace. And so I think that to answer that question, market research was tough to really nail down and sift through some of those different experiences across the spectrum with this population.
Yeah, I can imagine there's so many moving pieces. So to look at it all and find the similarities and patterns to find your North Star and direction can be overwhelming.
Yeah. And I think as PTs, it's been much cleaner with the clinical community. And like we've done market research that is, it's not been like me asking all my PT friends. It's been like, let's try to get the unbiased,
Of course.
And I think functional principles really ring with us, which fortunately you also have. If you work in inpatient rehab, you have all of that experience in your head, and you get why that makes sense. But that still is the choice of an individual patient to choose the device that is less safe because for maybe some small reason, it's a fit for them. And I think you see a lot of that in this space, but that's going to be there regardless. It's almost like market research that you can't ignore, but it's almost like out of your control to a certain extent, right?
My takeaway from this is it's certainly not easy, but it's sounding doable. So if someone woke up with an idea and they thought, I want to be Matt when I grow up, what are maybe your 5 tips of what to do or either things to avoid if they want to pursue this sort of path?
Or 3. We're flexible. We'll reach for the stars with 5, but
I would say my number one is to ask for help early and often. Whatever you think it is, if you think you know someone who has some insight or can get you some insight to what you're interested in, I think asking for help goes a long way. I would say early 10, 15-minute conversations I look back on as pivotal with people who were kind of experts. And then what I did on the back of that was really impactful, right? Like a 10, 15-minute conversation that then dictated what I did for the next month, and got me to like a next sort of stage.
Even asking for help, that seems like another way of saying one of our favorite words, which is networking.
yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever you're trying to do, network and it will happen.
And networking too, that brings up such a good point where you're asking people for help, but you're also asking in a way to challenge your idea, which gives you just a completely new perspective to build it in a different direction and to really put out a product you're proud of.
I mean, networking has been a huge aspect of it. I think asking for help you kind of hit on it where it's you're like specifically challenging what you're trying to do, right? Like when I said, what does success look like for this? It was almost like I wanted to hear the hard answer to that to help me decide the honest truth of like, should I be like even going after this, right?
Yeah. And
does that make sense?
For sure. And I think just the theme of what you've been telling us is that you want to be accountable and put integrity out with the product that you do. Just when in the moments that you're communicating with your engineering team, with your structural design team, to make sure that whatever changes are being made, it's going back to the patient and it's going to be achieving the goal you initially set out to. So being able to collaborate with all of them, but still stay true, I think having that accountability is huge as well.
I would maybe make that a number 2. Stay sincere and honest to why you go into whatever you're going into, because you're gonna be hit with so many different things early on. It winds up being hard to do, but having that barometer to kind of fall back on, I think especially this is with the assumption that us being in our roles, it's to help people right at the end of the day. So that's something that I think I come at it from this space because so many devices that are out there, I feel like they lean on gimmick in a lot of way. Yeah. And that's then why I'm like, felt like I needed to get into this space to kind of help in a different way, was because it at the end of the day, the output is not something that is beneficial necessarily in the way that you're marketing it. Right.
Right. So in addition to just being outcome based, just having that moral compass and staying true to your initial intentions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I hear that too. I think something I've noticed with just interviewing everyone that we have so far is there's been like that moment where they're like, oh, this is the thing I want to change. This is the part that I want to pursue. So just hearing that where you're like, this is where I was seeing the gimmicky, this is where I was seeing the need, then I just kind of took off from there. Had a bunch of other peripheral events happen that kind of nudged you in that direction, but identifying that and being able to keep that throughout the course of your product and your company, I think that's really impressive. I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Did you have any like Shark Tank moments where you've had to really like pitch yourself and sell your product to get investors? Did you have any of that exposure?
So much.
Yeah. Cool. Tell
us. we did we're still at the tail end of what we're looking for.
Yeah.
But fortunately we've gotten through the vast majority of it. But tons of those kind of, you have 10 minutes, go, type pitches. And that's all you have. And it's very true that like, you walk out of the Shark Tank and if you didn't get it, that like, that's it. And that's been it's been like its own job. It's a very involved process and lots of layers to it. Unlike Shark Tank, it's not like check right then and there. There's a whole...
It's the Hollywood take on it.
Yeah. I guess if you were to go down that kind of a path, it's a lot to know about on the fundraising side. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of rejection and then success. There's due diligence process. There's what type of incorporation you need to have at what stage. There's all sorts of things that go into it. It's its own world, and it very much acts seems to act the same way for everyone. But it's if you think you're going into something that's going to need investment, that was another where I had no idea what I was getting into.
Yeah.
As soon as this was building to where we would need that to get it off the ground, I didn't know what I was saying yes to.
Did you have partners in that kind of helped you see the way through, or was it very much finding your own way, or a bit of both?
I was going to say, a bit of both. I had an early advisor, part of that incubator process, who became a partner. So he's now our COO, and it's still a very core team. But we go into all those pitches together. He's had a lot of experience in that kind of startup sphere through his career, more on like operations, supply chain side of things. And so he's been really helpful, just literally to have in the room, and also to this a lot of like teaching and learning what to expect.
Yeah. So you've had to assemble your own team of Avengers, right?
Yeah.
Any advice for assembling a team that does really well?
I think take your time. And I think in the early going, attitude matters a lot. Maybe more so than I wouldn't say like experience, but you'd rather have someone with a great attitude who can kind of like learn on the fly with things.
Yeah.
Because there is so much that's helter-skelter, and you want to kind of keep each other centered on stuff.
Yeah.
But those are probably my 2 points: is take your time for who you think the right fit might be, and be ready to kind of like be in trenches. And so you want to have someone with great attitude next to you.
I was just going to say, at this point, you really are in the trenches. So you want to be able to look over and know someone has your back. So yeah, definitely having that team mentality is huge.
Yeah.
You've given us so much on this call. Anyone who's listening, what can we give back to you?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. Honestly, if you're listening, following at Nuvio Mobility, kind of like following our journey as we ramp up in the coming months, we're going to do some PR and promotional, and I really want this to be, and it has been, clinician led. People listening on this is who we've tried to develop this with, and as much for as those patients that you're treating. And, whether you like the device or not, I think that's important to have said. And so we're hoping to have the support of the clinical community in that. And that would probably be the help that I ask is help us spread the word about this device. My company is called Nuvio, Nuvio. We are taking an outcomes-based, very clinician-led approach to developing novel assistive devices, the modern walker, you could say.
The evolution beyond tennis balls.
The evolution beyond tennis balls.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for being on our podcast. I've learned so much. I'm so excited to follow your company. I'm so excited to see where it goes. And you've just been a delightful guest. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. This has been great.
Yeah. Thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of the Beyond These Clinic Walls podcast. As always, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Beyond These Clinic Walls for all the latest updates and episode releases. Make sure to join the Clinician Transition group on LinkedIn and Slack to be part of the networking community for like-minded rehab professionals. Questions, comments, concerns, or do you know someone who might make an excellent guest on our next show? Reach out to us at beyondtheseclinicwalls@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.